So thanks everybody for joining us on this, in Ann Arbor at least, snowy, beautiful January day. Really excited for everyone joining us. This is our first PSC Brown Bag of the semester, and we're really, really delighted. I'd like to just remember to tell everyone that if you want to turn on or off the captioning service that's going on, you can do that at the bottom of your screen. I think everybody is rolling in muted, but please mute yourself and keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. And you can use the chat to post questions, or you can raise your hand. We're going to ask that you keep your questions to the end of the presentation today for Dr. Faber's preference. And we're going to wrap up around 12:55 so we can get to the conversation that we have with trainees and the speaker at the end. So today I'd really like to tell you how excited we are to have Dr. Jacob Faber, an associate professor at NYU's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, and with a joint appointment in NYU's Sociology department. His research and teaching focuses on spatial inequality, and he leverages observational and experimental methods to study the mechanisms responsible for sorting individuals across space and how the distribution of people by race and class interacts with political, social, and economic and ecological systems to create and sustain economic disparities. So while there's a rich literature exploring the geography of opportunity, there remain quite a few unsettled questions about the causes of segregation and its effects on the residents of urban ghettos, wealthy suburbs, and the diverse set of places in between. So the paper title will come up in a moment, but Dr. Faber, I would be delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to start this presentation. Hopefully everything works as it just did. All right, can you see the slides? All right, great. Yeah, so I would prefer to handle substantive questions at the end of the presentation, but I'm happy to answer clarifying questions throughout, and I'll keep the chat open. I'll try to keep an eye on it. And I have about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. Is that right? Okay, great. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be giving this talk. I was really hoping to be there in person, but you know, things are what they are. I really appreciate everyone who's helped organize this, in addition to Sarah, Bob, Paula, and Lakeisha, and I appreciate everyone coming today. I really am looking forward to sharing some work in progress and getting some feedback from this group. So what I am hoping to show, and this is building on my prior work on the consequences of federal housing policies during the New Deal, which is part of now a really burgeoning cottage industry of research on this topic. But so far, to my knowledge, nobody has looked at the ways that these policies affected homeownership access specifically. And what I am hopefully going to show is that these massive housing policies that were designed to stabilize the housing market, but in a heavily racialized way, was quite effective at doing so, and in a heavily racialized way. So I wanted to start with, this last week we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and this is a now famous quote argument of his. This idea that in the United States we have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. And I think that this is a really important lens for understanding the American welfare state. And as a housing person, I've unfortunately only learned this recently, but the lead up to this argument is largely about housing and development. So this is immediately preceding this quote. So the fact is that everybody in this country lives on welfare. And then he immediately talks about federal housing policies. Suburbia was built with federally subsidized credit, which we're going to talk about today, as well as highways, et cetera. So everyone's on welfare in this country. And he is making this point not only about the race and class nature of the welfare state, but also implications that welfare state has, and specifically in the examples that he mentioned, the development of housing in neighborhoods in metropolitan areas for ongoing racial inequality. So I am going to focus primarily on one housing program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which I'll describe in the next slide or so, and then discuss my approach of merging these newly digitized archival data on the extent of the Homeowners Loan Corporation with more contemporary data sets before going into some preliminary results and discuss some next steps for the analysis that I see. And again, would love to hear your feedback on any and all of this. So we usually think about the Great Depression as an employment crisis, and it certainly was. Unemployment was about 25%, and over 30 million people were in families with no regular full-time wage earner in the early 1930s. And the New Deal, but the Great Depression was also importantly a housing crisis. About half of mortgage debt was in default. There were hundreds of thousands of people who were evicted, and millions of people became homeless because of disruption in the housing market. So in response, FDR, depicted here as a doctor treating an ill Uncle Sam with the help of a largely compliant Democratic supermajority in Congress, enacted a wide range of policies known as the New Deal. And we see these New Deal remedies in acronym form here on the table next to our ill Uncle Sam. And we're all familiar now with the alphabet soup that comprise these programs. There was enormous jobs programs that put millions of people to work on public projects, the arts, infrastructure. This was the birth of the American social safety net. There were important labor rights and union protections. And there were also these massive investments in housing, including the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, which I'm going to focus on for much of the rest of the today. It's in the middle of the table here. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was passed in '33 to stabilize the housing market. It effectively allowed people to avoid pending foreclosure or gain back control over property that had already been lost to foreclosure. It granted $3 billion in its first 2 years on 1 million mortgages. This is about 1 in every 10 homes. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which Ken Jackson wrote about in '87, I believe, maybe '85, and Richard Rothstein wrote about more recently, described how HOLC, as well as these other federal housing programs, which I'll describe more briefly, were responsible for creating the American homeownership society, that they institutionalized the long-term uniform payment mortgage that has become the primary tool for asset accumulation for the vast majority of Americans. So it's worth pausing to emphasize how important this change was, because prior to HOLC, there was no standardized mortgage credit. You were reliant on what some historians called a patchwork of mortgage policies. So HOLC saved an industry that was in distress and put a lot of people to work as well. But it again established this primary tool for wealth accumulation. And that's why, in large part, why the racist design and implementation and importantly inheritance of HOLC are so important to study. So HOLC institutionalized, it didn't invent, but it institutionalized the practice of redlining. which many of us are familiar with now. Redlining refers to the denial of mortgage credit to communities of color. And part of Holk's implementation was making these now infamous, they were called residential security maps of hundreds of cities across the country, where appraisers graded the lending risk within neighborhoods in all of these cities, and they got A to D grades. D grades were colored red, and hence the term redlining. And over subsequent decades, housing finance became harder to come by, if not impossible, in red areas. And these grades were based on a number of factors, including housing conditions, economic activity, and many historians argue, most importantly, race. And we know this because in addition to these single letter grades, appraisers provided rich descriptions of the neighborhoods that they appraised. So I'm going to show you an excerpt of the appraisal for this this one redlined neighborhood here in Atlanta. So this is the first about a third or a quarter of the appraisal form that was filled out for this neighborhood. And most importantly, at the top are listed favorable and detrimental influences. And under detrimental influences, we have income instability, mixture of racial groups, juvenile delinquency, infant mortality, crime, etc. And then immediately below that, a description of the neighborhood's inhabitants, including their occupation, their foreign-born status, and importantly, the only racial category here, percent Negro. So historians such as Nathan Conley and Ken Jackson and others who have conducted deeper analyses of these narratives documented almost an obsession of appraisers with the presence of Black households. Here's another map for Cleveland. The Cleveland map as well as the Atlanta map show quite well another bias that the appraisers had built into their appraisal practices, which was a strong preference for more suburban neighborhoods. You can see that downtowns in both cities were almost exclusively redlined, and the highest grades, these C and D, blue and green respectively, neighborhoods, grades were almost exclusively reserved for more suburban areas in the metropolitan region. To give some idea of the scale and scope of these appraisals, the data that I use come from this amazing project, the Mapping Inequality Project, where they digitized hundreds of these maps from the Holk archives and put them online for free, and everybody can go and look at them. It's really an amazing resource. But you can see that this touched a great deal of the country, especially in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic and the Rust Belt, places with the most dense populations at the time, but also spotted throughout the Midwest and the South, and some in the far West, but not as much in the mountain region. So again, my primary question here is how did these patterns of Holk grading structure and racialize access to homeownership, connecting these geographic patterns of this important historical process to contemporary patterns of inequality. And Holk was a very long time ago. Again, it was passed in 1933. Most of the maps were made in the late 1930s. So it's worth thinking about related historical processes and Holk's place in them. So without turning this into a lecture about the history of American housing policy, I mentioned this earlier, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the GI Bill inherited Holk's redlining practices. They also expanded the use of restricted covenants, excluding many groups, including Blacks and Jews, most prominently from buying homes. And these policies funneled billions of dollars of investment away from urban communities of color and towards white suburbs. These two policies were much larger than Hulk. By 1972, the FHA had helped about 11 million households buy homes, and homeownership increased from under 50% to almost 2/3 over this time. And fewer than 1% of these loans went to Black households. And so as home ownership opportunities were opening up to white Americans, we were building segregated public housing. And as Dr. King mentioned, using highways to segregate neighborhoods and connect suburbs to job centers, as well as displacing hundreds of thousands, disproportionately people of color through urban renewal. Yes, Bruce, sociologists from at the University of Chicago were fundamental in coming up with the Hulk appraisal practices that this, most importantly, this kind of central city to suburb gradient was based on the arguments made by some of those sociologists. And this kind of conflation of race and lending risk constrained housing choices for African Americans, creating opportunities for exploitation through the practices of blockbusting, et cetera. And private lenders also adopted these redlining practices. So, Hulk certainly didn't invent racism in real estate, but it institutionalized it, kind of setting these and other processes in motion. And borrowing from Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's wonderful book, The Rise of Homeownership After World War II, kind of cemented this practice, this cultural and economic practice, as a feature of how we can conceptualize citizenship and belonging in the United States, if we think about the kind of sociological importance and function of homeownership. And thinking about this kind of more holistically, David Freund in Colored Property argued that Hulk kind of created what he called a discriminatory marketplace by making it easier to discriminate. It kind of gave birth to this market where wealth accumulation, both on the individual and the neighborhood level, was equated with whiteness. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, again, this idea of predatory inclusion, where discrimination was good business, and it reinforced this idea that Blacks were unfit for homeownership, which is very similar to an idea put forth by Ibram Kendi and Stand From the Beginning, this kind of vicious cycle of disinvestment and devaluation in the housing market, where disinvestment leads to worse housing, which leads to further disinvestment, et cetera, et cetera. And there's, of course, a heavily racialized layer to all of this. So in coming back to the kind of current study, my strategy is designed kind of in pursuit of a rather simple task, exploring racial differences in the change over time in access to home ownership and home value between places that were and were not appraised by Hulk. My primary concern is Black-white dynamics, and this is for a number of reasons. I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A, but primarily we know that Hulk appraisals were quite sensitive to the presence of Black residents. Even a single Black person within a neighborhood could lead to a D grade. And dramatic changes in immigration policy over the 20th century also kind of makes comparisons within and across Latino and Asian groups a little more challenging here. So the kind of ideal data would be kind of longitudinal measures of kind of race and socioeconomic status and housing characteristics for geographically stable neighborhoods and places before Hulk and in subsequent decades. Unfortunately, those data don't exist. So I have to rely on an imperfect measures of changing race and homeownership axis gathered from multiple census data sources. So I rely on the individual level IPUMS data for before the Homeowners Loan Corporation, as well as after. So I pull data from every census from 1900 to 2010. This actually should not have 1950 in here. 1950 is not in here because the housing variables are quite wonky for that decade. And the 1970 sample is not in here because it's also quite wonky. I also added in data from the 2006 ACS and the 2019 ACS to capture the housing boom and bust of the early 21st century, and then what's happened since. So this in total, excuse me, there were over 68 million individual records, and that's too many for my computer right now. So I took a 25% sample of that, and then again, I only look at Black and white individuals who have full covariate data and were living in counties that were part of a metro area before Hulk, or became part of a metropolitan area between then and now. So that leaves me with just over 7 million records. So my measures here of federal intervention are kind of whether or not a metropolitan area had a Hulk map. And there's an important endogeneity concern built into this, which is that the Hulk guidelines requested maps for all cities with populations above 40,000. And I'm still trying to figure out what to do with this in this context where my treatment effect here is on the metro level. In prior work, I've leveraged the fact that these guidelines were far from perfectly implemented. So there are lots of cities that had smaller populations than this cutoff that were graded, and several that were above this cutoff and were not graded for reasons that are probably lost to history. But again, operationalizing this on the metropolitan level is something that I haven't quite figured out yet, but would love to talk through it with you if you have ideas. And the two outcomes that I'm interested in are home ownership, which I have measures for across the entire time period, and then home values, which the census only started asking, or at least the IPUMS data only started reporting in 1930. So I'm thankful that I get at least one data point before this policy went into effect. I mentioned covariates on the previous slide. I have individual level measures of marital status, age, occupational score calculated by IPUMS, family size, foreign-born status, and a measure of whether or not they're living in their birth state. I'm somewhat limited here in the covariates I can use because, again, I need them to be consistently measured across this entire time period, and certainly you can argue that some of these might not be so. My analytical strategy is a triple difference here, difference in difference in difference, where I'm regressing the outcome of interest, there's home ownership or home value, on a three-way interaction between, again, whether or not a metro area was appraised, this post-Hulk indicator variable for decades 1940 and later, and then an indicator variable for whether or not an individual is Black. So we can think about the results here as beta 5, this interaction between appraisal and post-Hulk, as the impact of Hulk on whites, and then beta 6 is this impact of the estimate of the difference in impact between Blacks and whites. There are, again, a number of individual level SES characteristics that I have, indicators for when the metropolitan area kind of started, and several other kind of controls. Standard errors are clustered at the metro level, and these are weighted as IPUMs suggest. So just descriptively to look at these two outcomes. So here's home ownership rates for Blacks and whites across this time period, depended on whether or not they were appraised or living in an appraised area or not. And so we can see a number of things in this chart. First, a pretty dramatic rise in home ownership in the post-1940 period for both races that coincided with suburbanization. We can see the impacts of the Great Depression as well as the more recent Great Recession in here. And we can see, importantly, that for whites living in Hulk appraised places, that the homeownership rate kind of converged quite a bit after Hulk with whites who were not living in appraised places. And so the Black-white gap in homeownership increased over this time period as well as the gap between Hulk and non-Hulk places. So giving some indication of the story that I'm trying to investigate here. There's kind of similar patterns with respect to home value, that the gap, both ways of measuring the gap kind of increased across this time period. And again, there's a kind of distancing that is experienced by kind of whites living in places that were appraised, whereas kind of Blacks that are living in places that were appraised kind of saw kind of muted home value growth. So getting into the triple difference estimates, I'm going to show a series of coefficient plots here. Again, these have region by year fixed effects, controls, and clustered standard errors. So the first measure here is, again, just kind of looking at the impact on whites. This indicator for post-Hulk and interacted with the indicator for Hulk. These are the coefficients for that interaction. We can see that there's positive and highly significant impact on home ownership, kind of with or without covariates. The home value story is positive, but not nearly as precise, which is something that I'm unpacking as well. For African Americans, the story is far more consistent, that there is this negative significant coefficient in all four of these regressions, indicating significant differences in the impact of Hulk on home ownership and home value for African Americans. There are a lot of reasons to suspect that there's going to be kind of heterogeneity in these effects. And one place that I started looking was kind of occupation, which is it's the best consistent measure of socioeconomic status that I have across this entire time period. Educational attainment is not available in all of these years. That might be in a subset of years. Income is also not available in all of these years. I believe they started asking about income in 1940. So we have this IPUMS generated measure of occupational status that is an estimate of the kind of average income of people who are in a given occupation. So what we see here are interactions with indicator variables for the bottom quintile, the middle quintile, and the top quintile. And there's an interesting thing happening for both whites and Blacks. So for whites, it seems like there is a pretty positive effect for both the lowest occupational status and the highest occupational status whites, but not as much, a quite muted effect for those in the middle of the distribution here, which again is quite interesting and perhaps somewhat contradictory to the story that at least that I've read about these policies. For Blacks, we see that the kind of negative effects of these policies are generally concentrated among poor and middle income African Americans. That the wealthiest African Americans seem to be to not have this kind of significant effect. Kind of geographic heterogeneity is also something that I was considering here. So we don't, we can and should discuss what a suburb is. There are measures in IPUMs where people report whether or not they live in a suburb. I found those measures to be quite strange. So instead, I'm just using an indicator variable to stratify the sample based on whether or not somebody reports living in a primary city or not. And so the figure on the left is the same figure from a couple of slides ago among individuals who live in primary cities, and the one on the right is among people who don't. And I'm looking at these together, as well as coefficient plots for triple difference estimates within these samples. We can kind of suss out that the impact of Hulk, if we're willing to adopt a kind of causal framework here, kind of primarily rewarded white suburbanites, which is quite in line with all of the prior literature on these policies, and that it primarily penalized Blacks who were living in cities as well. So moving forward with this, there's a lot of different directions that I'm hoping to take this in, as well as, again, kind of focusing and sharpening this analysis here. Kind of in sum, what I'm finding is that Hulk, as designed, facilitated this process of homeownership growing and also becoming this site of extreme racial inequality, that Black homeownership rose over this time period. It seems that it did so in response to these policies, but Black homeownership today is about where white homeownership was in 1900. So there's still these enormous gaps that seem to have been exacerbated by Hulk. In terms of next steps with this analysis, I still am trying to suss out the specific mechanisms here, and we can think about and talk about the many different ways through that this could have led to the results that we have. And I'm also curious about the role of mobility here, since we are talking about people's housing decisions. Presumably, people are moving. So, how should we be thinking about that, both kind of theoretically and then kind of empirically with the data that we have, is something that I'm curious about. Excuse me. And then I have a couple of related projects to this as well. The first is again trying to assess the subsequent housing programs that again were much larger than Hulk, including the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, the GI Bill. I've recently found that there are records of these policies in a federal data center in College Park, Maryland, and as soon as Omicron settles down a bit, I will be driving down there. And then the kind of connecting this to, again, these another important historical process for understanding kind of city, suburb, Black, white, differences in neighborhood and homeowner and housing inequality is the relationship with urban renewal. So the Mapping Inequality group has done a similar thing with urban renewal projects, and I'm working on a project looking at the geography of those, which does seem to be quite related to the geography of redlining, though in an interesting kind of racialized way, where the likelihood of kind of having an urban renewal project in a neighborhood is a function of the racial makeup of that neighborhood, as well as an interaction between that and whether or not it received a D grade. So this kind of inheritance of housing and investment inequality seems to have been kind of racialized in an interesting and important to understand way. So I know that I think I felt like I went through a lot of that quickly. So I hope to kind of answer questions that you have. I'm now looking at the chat, but kind of happy to hear additional questions. Thank you again for listening to that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Faber. That was a great presentation. I think you can stop sharing if you like so that folks can see faces, but we can always pop those slides back up if necessary. I'm going to go ahead and sort of run the chat. I think we'll start with the folks that drop questions in, and then I'm going to go to hands that I see, or folks can drop more questions in the chat. So thank you so much for the talk. I also just wanted to point out just really quickly, because I forgot at the beginning, that our next Brown Bag is next week, January 31st, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Grace Nopert, who is a University of Michigan faculty member on the scars of life course trauma on the immune system. So that's one to tune in for as well. At this point, though, I'd like to turn it over to Trent Alexander, who had a couple of questions and kind of got in there early.
Sure. Thanks for the talk, Jacob. That was really great. One of the questions I put in the chat was I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the cost of working with only 25% of cases. Metro areas, when you have a 1% sample, they end up being quite small, especially if you're looking at the different racial groups. I really bet you could benefit from that other 75%, but I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree, and my plan right now is to get my program where I need it to be, and then Control D and walk away from my computer for a couple days maybe.
Yep. Okay.
But yeah, that's the current plan, right? And so because just to state explicitly, I have like 25% of this 1%. That can be a big problem.
I had one more that I'll just say. I'm referring to something you said at the very beginning, which is that you have to worry about what kind of areas were treated by Holk and which weren't, because you're comparing them. And if they're really different, then those comparisons aren't apples to apples. I just wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah. So the biggest difference is the population size. In my previous paper that looked at the effect of Holk on segregation found that in terms of segregation, the cities are quite comparable in terms of most measures of segregation. But I haven't, and I should look at the kind of outcomes that I'm looking at here. Yeah, and to simultaneously kind of address this other question about kind of suburbs being mapped by Holk. I think this is kind of quite related to Trent's question, because so we primarily think of this Holk mapping apparatus as an urban phenomenon, and it primarily was, but you can see in many of the maps that they kind of leaked into kind of suburban areas. And then again, there were other, and I don't know why these maps were made, and it's hard to know whether or not we will ever know, but there were maps made of larger geographies as well. So there were entire counties that were mapped, such as Essex County in New Jersey, and Westchester County in New York, which are two suburban counties, suburbs around New York City and Newark. There were also maps that were for sub-metropolitan areas. So there were some suburban places that were appraised by Holk. But kind of more fundamentally, one of the things that I'm kind of struggling with, again, kind of both conceptually and empirically, is we have this idea, which is probably true, that these policies altogether kind of accelerated suburbanization by, again, kind of pulling white Americans primarily out of cities and into suburbs. So, part of the story that I want to kind of tease out is this kind of proximity story. So if a kind of city was redlined, how does that affect the likelihood that a suburban subdivision in the county over, or in the same county but a couple miles away, come to be? And that's why in the current iteration of this, I'm measuring this at the metropolitan level. But I'm kind of more than happy to think critically about that measurement.
Barbara Anderson had a question.
Yes. I imagine you're using high occupations and low occupations as a proxy for income and for ability to buy certain kinds of houses. But aren't within occupations and even your high and low occupations, aren't the income of Black people lower than the incomes of white people? So doesn't that, I'm not saying what you're doing isn't worth it, but doesn't that bias your results?
No, you're absolutely right that there are going to be these kind of intra-occupation differences across race. So, and I think especially during this time period, pre-civil rights era, in the early 20th century. So I don't know what that would change is the interpretation of those interacted models. So what does it mean to be in a kind of high occupation job as an African American? It probably doesn't mean the same thing as being in a high occupation job as a white person. So I would have to think about that. Again, unfortunately, we don't have anything better than that from IPUMS, but your point is spot on.
And I think Trent added some really good commentary there. Trent being the IPUMS pro here. And a really great resource that the occupational income score being used ranks occupations by the average income within the occupation for all people doing the job, regardless of race. But of course, there is that extreme heterogeneity even within, and that you could use income when you can from 1940 to 2019.
It would also be good to use income directly when you can, because of that racial difference within the occupations, your income is actually less for your Black respondents than what you're estimating. So you're overestimating, in a sense, the discrimination effects to some extent from that.
Yeah.
But possibly also because of the composition of households and how many breadwinners or occupational inhabitants there were, and all of those kinds of pieces too. I think that it's there's so many really important questions with the data as good as they are. And let's see, it looks like Bruce Mitchell has another question.
Yeah, I was wondering whether maybe breaking this down to a regional analysis might allow you to raise the number of cases and also interrogate some interesting contrasts between, say, the South, the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, which could bring some additional context to what you're doing here.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. In my previous paper, I did find a huge difference between the South and the rest of the country. So that is a kind of warrants exploration here. I also kind of thinking through that would argue that the kind of counterfactual exercise of comparing appraised and unappraised places, limiting that analysis to the kind of Northeast and Midwest might be kind of quite a bit cleaner, given the kind of wide kind of appraisal of places in those two regions. That there's probably more disparate mapping in the South and in the West in particular. So that's a good idea.
Thank you. Are there other folks who would like to hop in? It looks like Helen, who had a really cute dog, passed through their screen a moment ago, has a question.
Hi, thank you. So I'm trying to wrap my head around, maybe, I don't know if it's a part of your model, or I guess it can be more conceptual as well too. So I'm very familiar with Milwaukee, and Milwaukee's appraisals were mostly based on, and redlining was mostly based on immigrant status, right? Because they didn't have a large African-American population until the second Great Migration. And so one of the things that, I'm very interested in understanding better is how these grades have impacted the place. Because now in those redlined area, previously historically redlined areas, it's 95% Black, lots of comorbidities and things like that. So how are you, I guess, in your models, and I might have missed it, because I like to stare at models for a while, kind of incorporating for, so you're looking at the Black-white differences in home ownership, but what how are you factoring in that some of these redline decisions weren't necessarily made on Black-white status necessarily, but other factors, including immigration status of the tract and things like that?
Yeah, it's a great point, and speaks to what I've seen as a kind of common misperception of redlining, which is that it was exclusively driven by race. Where, and to your, I think in most cities, it was mostly driven by kind of immigration, just because of, there were so few Black people, even in the largest cities at that time. So we have this kind of duality here where the grades for most places were probably not driven by the presence of African Americans, but the presence of a single African American could drive your entire neighborhood's grade. And so I think unpacking that is really important. One of the things that I'm kind of struggling with here, and I think this speaks to your point, if not, please kind of correct me, is there's a question, there's a big question overarching all of this research of what do these maps mean? I in this kind of project, as well as in my previous project, I am thinking that they kind of set these places on certain trajectories that were that ended up having these highly racialized outcomes. And some of that was due to the effect that the grades had on a kind of direct effect of the grades on investment that kind of turns into housing quality, that then turns into kind of migration, pushing or pulling. And of course, there's a huge kind of immigration story there, especially in these old Rust Belt cities like Milwaukee. There's also, there was a recent NBER paper where they pulled, where they had all this, right, this whole, I see lots of nodding heads, right, it's a great paper where they found that Hulk was far less discriminatory than these subsequent housing programs, maybe even kind of minimally discriminatory, which is a really interesting finding. And of course, again, it speaks to this question of like, what do these maps mean? Do they mean that, if I could actually just kind of share screen, I have some other slides here. So we know, for example, that like the Federal Housing Administration kind of inherited these appraisal policies and these redlining practices that Holk did. Unfortunately, we only have one FHA appraisal map because the FHA destroyed all of the maps because of a lawsuit, discrimination lawsuit. But the kind of areas that the FHA redlined seem to overlap quite well with the areas that Holk redlined. So if there was some kind of lingering impact of getting an A versus a D grade as places were transitioning from kind of Holk practices to FHA practices, that could be part of what's going on here. I also very recently saw these data from now an old paper where they got spending data on the county level for all of these major New Deal programs during the 1930s. And the scatter plot shows that there's a really strong correlation between Holk spending per capita and FHA spending per capita. That could be, there's a lot of indigeneity in here, of course. And then the two the series of bar graphs on the right here, the first shows, again, this kind of Holk spending per capita based on appraisal status, and then FHA spending per capita based on appraisal status. And this appraisal status seems like a far better, this makes complete sense, a far better predictor of Holk spending than FHA spending. But it does seem to be a pretty good predictor of FHA spending as well. And in kind of naive regression models, it kind of retains an explanatory power kind of net of Holk spending per capita. So, in my argument, which I believe, but it's kind of one based on kind of historical and circumstantial evidence, is that that Holk kind of set these other processes in motion, but kind of teasing that out empirically is something that I think is going to take a lot more time and effort. Sorry, I went on a really long tangent there, but it's just a big puzzle that I have.
Absolutely. And Bruce added a little point there about the NBER paper. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that, Bruce.
Oh, yeah. It was only 3 cities. So I've been in conversation with one of the authors of that paper about their analysis. And, this all speaks to kind of questions about mechanisms. And I have my fingers crossed that the records in that dusty box are going to have some answers in them. But
thank you.
Maybe I can come back and present in a year and a half.
When we're in person, hopefully, and we can all, go to all on this over lunch.
Yeah.
I think at this point, we are at the point where we usually transition to having a conversation with our trainees. And so I want to thank everyone for your participation and good questions. And I know you can follow up with Dr. Faber later. That makes sense to you, but thanks so much for coming. And thanks, Dr. Faber, for a really exciting and stimulating presentation. So I'd ask the trainees to go ahead and stay on. We'll wait a moment for folks to depart. Bob, yes, you can stop recording now. Thank you.